Hello students, good afternoon. Today we are having a lesson on the Victorians and characterisation. So, the early Victorian novelists had in common a special climate of ideas and feelings, joined to a set of fundamental assumptions. It was this special climate that the later novelists of the century were to question, even though the great mass of the reading public still took them for granted. And this points to another main difference between the novelists of the first half of the Victorian age and those of the second half. The former, those of the first half, were at one with their public to a remarkable degree. In other words, they were conditioned by it and they identified themselves with their age, being their spokesman. The later novelists, however, were writing in some sense against their age. In fact, they were critical, sometimes hostile, to its dominant assumptions. So we have a difference between early Victorians and later Victorian novelists. The sense of identity with their times was of a great importance in any consideration of the early Victorian novelists. This attitude towards their age made them differ from the other European writers. It is not that the Victorians were uncritical. No, this is a mistake. They were not uncritical of their time and country, but their criticism was less radical than the criticism of Balzac, Stendhal, Flaubert, and Dostoevsky. All that depended on the condition of England as compared with that of France or Russia. France had suffered a deep descent from the heroic ages of Napoleon. Glory had departed, and the descent was into vulgarity, into everything that could be summarized in the world of the bourgeoisie. In this atmosphere, Balzac, Stendhal, and Flaubert turned towards this world in disgust and fought against it and its hypocrisy. In them, realism as an aesthetic creed was born. In Russia, instead, the novel was seen as a weapon in the fight against a feudal despotism whose main defense was a rigorous censorship, and the novel became the main vehicle of criticism of society, of morals, of the Russian attitude to the West, of man's relation to God and to his fellows. So, as far as it concerns the great Victorians themselves, they accepted the society in which they lived without question, or rather, when they criticized it as many of their readers were doing. They voiced their doubts and fears. The Victorians were conscious of the tensions and contradictions of their times, the havoc caused by the Industrial Revolution, the presence of mass poverty, the existence side by side of what Disraeli called the two nations. The forces set in motion by the Industrial Revolution they did not know how to control, and the working of what seemed the iron laws of economics outraged the consciousness of the most intelligent of the time. They were, in other words, thoroughly aware of the evils of their age, yet they could hardly not believe that these evils, awkward though they were to surmount, would prove to be merely temporary. For on all sides was the plainest possible evidence of enormous increase in material wealth and the physical amenities of civilization. There were, of course, dissident voices as Carlyle, Ruskin, but broadly the early Victorians accepted the idea of progress without much question. The age represented the triumph of Protestantism, and perhaps its great achievement was the universal acceptance of the idea of respectability. The Industrial Revolution, in a sense, changed nothing, but it brought to public attention evils that had always existed. There had always been overcrowding, there had always been drunkenness, there had always been sweat shops in cellars and exploitation of children in industry. But now they existed on so large a scale that awareness of them had become unavoidable, and the viciousness and misery they bred were such as no man of goodwill could contemplate without horror. The respectability of the age was a code governed by considerations of good form, of what was probably sanctioned. It was the respectable who composed the reading public, and it was for the respectable that the great Victorian novelists wrote. If they interpreted that public in middle-class terms, their intuition was right, for their working-class readers also aspired to middle-class status. The distinction between the novelist as an artist and the novelist as a public entertainer had not yet been made, and their power and authority were the greater because of that. A great entertainer was Charles Dickens. The public he wrote for was largely a new public, brought to consciousness by the Industrial Revolution, with whom he had to identify himself. In other words, we can say that Dickens was the expression of his age, of its conscience, showing to his readers what they themselves thought and felt of the great social problems which confronted them, or rather, reading him, they discovered what they thought and felt. The test of life in his characters was that they went on living outside the book. The child's view of human beings is used by Dickens. He caught the externals, the apparently meaningless gestures and nervous tricks people had, without knowing they had them, and with these, the habits of speech, of repetitions, of favourite words and phrases, obsessional harpings on single themes, whose victims they all tended unconsciously to be, and which, taken together, made us in some degree walking caricatures of ourselves. This childlike vision of human beings conditioned Dickens' views of the world and made it a universe at times crude in conflicting black and white, at times sinister, and a heightened vision of the squalid, brutal, smelly, crowded London of his boyhood. Humour softens some characters and situations. It has often been noted that there is no communication between the characters in Dickens' novels. They are isolated, self-soliloquizing, beings born along each upon his balloon of individual fantasy. Dickens often concentrates his attention on the obsessional element in his characters, especially as far as it concerns their behavior. The great psychopathic characters are profoundly disturbing, especially since they are a manifestation of Dickens' increasing dissatisfaction with the society of his day. Dickens was essentially a comprehensive novelist. He had to take in all classes of society. The world he was creating was indeed a world with all the variety of the actual world, so it was necessary that he should find a substitute for picaresque. He found it in the novel of highly organized plot. He was using the novel quite deliberately as a vehicle for the criticism of society and plot, and it enabled him to represent, in the mirror of his own world, a fuller picture of the total society of his day than any English novelist had achieved before or since. Symbolism plays a considerable part in Dickens' novels, and it can only be described by examples. For example, Thomas Gradgrind represents the utilitarian philosophy which Dickens considered as the aggressive formulation of an inhumane spirit. What Gradgrind stands for is thou repellent, nevertheless respectable. His utilitarianism is a theory sincerely held, and there is intellectual disinterestedness in its application. But Gradgrind marries his eldest daughter to Josiah Bounderby, banker, merchant, manufacturer, about whom there is no disinterestedness whatever and nothing to be respected. Bounderby is Victorian ragged individualism in its grossest form, concerned with nothing but self-assertion and power and material success. He has no interest in ideals or ideas, except the idea of being the completely self-made man. Dickens here makes an observation about the affinities and practical tendency of utilitarianism, as in his presentment of the Gradgrind home and the Gradgrind elementary school, he does about the utilitarian spirit in Victorian education. Sissy Jupe, instead, opposes herself to the whole system, and she's a part of the poetically creative operation of Dickens' genius in that wonderful novel that we know as Hard Times.